and welcome to another exciting episode of the Cultivating Careers in Alternative Proteins podcast, a podcast which demonstrates how students and early career professionals can get into the alternative protein industry, as well as offers advice on how you can start a career in this revolutionary field. My goal of this podcast is to showcase the wide variety of roles within the alternative protein sector that exist, especially ones which people may not be aware of. This episode's guest is a great example of this. Maille O'Donnell is the Corporate Engagement Coordinator at the Good Food Institute, commonly referred to as GFI, which is one of the most prominent global nonprofit organizations in the alternative protein field. They have been a key driver to the success of alternative proteins over the past 6 years. One branch of their work is corporate engagement, where Maille and the rest of the corporate engagement team have worked with companies to increase the availability of alternative proteins to consumers. Furthermore, Maille has been involved in the hiring process for many positions at the Good Food Institute. Later in this episode, she shares her tips and advice for applying to jobs in the alternative protein industry, so be sure to listen to the end. Well, hello, Maille, and welcome to the Cultivating Careers in Alternative Proteins podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks so much, Jeffrey. I love your podcast and really excited to be here.
Appreciate that. Well, as I always start off by asking my guests, what really inspired you to get into the alternative protein space?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've cared really deeply about sustainability since I was pretty little. Maybe a lot of younger listeners of the podcast can relate to the experience of growing up hearing about climate change and biodiversity loss. And I knew from a young age that I wanted to orient my career around making an impact in sustainability. So that led me to study environmental science and policy in college, which is when I learned about industrial animal agriculture and the horrific impact it has on the natural environment, as well as farmed animals. And this issue is connected to so many things, obviously, biodiversity, farmed animal welfare and rights, preventing pandemics, food security, the list goes on. So in college, I actually became so passionate about this issue. I started a vegan resource blog. And that was sort of my contribution to the movement while I was not able to work in the sector yet. And I actually learned about GFI's senior year of college and followed their work until I graduated. And I believe that industrial animal agriculture is just one of the worst problems in the world, and alternative proteins are a highly tractable solution to solving that problem. And so I'm really excited to be able to make an impact in this space.
Wow, that's fantastic. And I love how you touched on the variety of different issues that animal agriculture causes, not just on the environment, but also from an animal welfare perspective, from pandemics and all those other horrible things. Yeah, alternative proteins can be a very viable and game-changing solution to tackling this problem.
Yeah, absolutely. It touches so much.
I'd really appreciate it if you could share the story of how you landed your position at the Good Food Institute and what the Good Food Institute is.
Yeah, for sure. So for those who are not familiar with GFI, we're an international network of nonprofits that works toward a sustainable and just food supply by increasing innovation in alternative proteins. So I work on the corporate engagement team, and we work with people across the food system, including food manufacturers and entrepreneurs, investors, retailers, food service companies, and the upstream supply chain companies as well, like ingredient and equipment suppliers. And our goal is to get alternative proteins, so products that can compete with animal product counterparts, like a plant-based chicken instead of a chicken that comes from an animal, to get these products to compete on taste and price with conventional animal products. And our theory of change is that once that happens, these products will be able to take the place of the more traditional meat products that people consume that are produced from an animal. I'm on the corporate engagement team, as I mentioned. We also have a policy team and a sci-tech team, and policy works toward open access research funding in alternative proteins, as well as advocating for a fair and transparent regulatory process. And then science and technology works with researchers and universities and students to build the alternative protein talent pipeline, as well as support open access research. And so coming back to your original question, the story of how I landed my position at GFI. So I was following the Good Food Institute's work through my senior year of college. And as soon as I learned about the theory of change, it just made perfect sense to me. I was doing, as I mentioned, I had my vegan resource blog, was doing some more kind of individual advocacy. And GFI's theory of change just struck me as a much more scalable and pragmatic approach to solving the problem. So I was a big fan of the organization, looking at their newsletters and everything. And then I was pretty fortunate that shortly after I graduated college, a position opened up at GFI. I applied, I made it to the final round, and then I actually didn't get that position. And I mention that because that's actually a pretty common experience at GFI. A lot of us have applied multiple times before landing in the roles that we ended up in. So if that's you, if you're listening, you're applying to GFI or another organization, definitely don't give up hope. I think persistence can really pay off. So the position that I did end up taking, the second position I applied for, was corporate engagement assistant. And I would say in terms of how I moved through the hiring process, one tip that I'd give is to be extremely prepared for written assignments as well as interviews. So I went through everything on the website, listened to podcasts. I made sure that I was able to demonstrate that I was really aligned with the mission and understood the theory of change and had done my homework throughout the hiring process. And then I think also having started that blog in college, even though I didn't have a ton of formal work experience outside of internships, I was able to use that to demonstrate, one, that I was self-motivated, that I was able to teach myself how to build a website, et cetera, and have this public display of my work product, which I think really helped me in the hiring process as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks for sharing that and showing that just because it didn't work out the first time doesn't mean you should just give up. Always push forward. If that's what you're committed to, then don't let anything stop you.
Yeah, exactly. Persistence can really pay off. And now looking back, of course, hindsight is 2020, but I'm so happy with the role that I actually ended up in. I think it would have been a much better fit for me than that first role.
Yeah, what specifically about what you learned in college have you been able to apply to the work that you're doing now?
First was just kind of the background knowledge on environmental systems and how animal agriculture impacts them. So I did a lot of research in college on the greenhouse gas input of the livestock industry and the connection between chicken farming in Maryland and eutrophication of the Chesapeake Bay. So there's a lot of research into those pretty specific environmental issues. And in terms of what I use in my work day to day, I mean, it was a lot of reading, writing, research, and at GFI, I help with a lot of writing items. I help with our newsletters, and then I also help edit reports and stuff like that. And so some of that kind of research, environmental policy reading type experience has helped me in that respect.
That makes sense.
But I'll also add to that, I think that coming back to the blog, I think that almost served me equally to my entire college major in terms of preparing me for the role, because one, again, it's writing, and then also part of my role at GFI is just being kind of a tech person and figuring out how to set up systems that make sense and are scalable to get our work done. And so that was a big part of preparing me for my role at GFI, which kind of feeds into a larger point that I don't think that people are listening and they're earlier in their careers. You don't need to necessarily gain experience just from a university program or from an internship or something. You can really gain experience on your own through starting a project like that. And you doing this podcast is also a perfect example of that. And I'm sure that you've learned so much from doing the podcast already. And that's a skill that you can maybe take to employers. So I just encourage people to think about their background and experience as maybe broader than most people typically think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people can really get caught up in thinking that, okay, this is the educational background I have to do something that's related to what I studied necessarily. And I don't think that's always the case, is what you study is actually what you end up doing with your career long term. And as you sort of mentioned, it's sometimes those side projects that you do, that's something that you're really passionate about, something you really enjoy. And if you do something that you enjoy, the old saying goes, you never work a day in your life. And not only that, but also doing a side project related to a potential job that you're applying to shows to employers that you're willing to take the initiative and you're willing to persist to do something on your own spare time.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree.
All right, I think you touched on it a bit briefly in one of your previous answers, but could you explain a little bit more about what your role in corporate engagement is like? Describe what you do on a day-to-day basis, because I don't think very many people are familiar with it.
Yeah, definitely. So as I mentioned, I started as the corporate engagement assistant where I got to do a little bit of everything, which was awesome. So a lot of research and writing, database management, project coordination. And now I've moved into a new position as CE coordinator. So I'm doing some of the same work. And then I'm also assisting with our content on the website, events, and I also write the suite of newsletters that comes from the corporate engagement department. So if you get the GF Ideas newsletter or Alternative Protein Opportunity, and if you're listening interested in those, you can sign up at gfi.org/newsletters. But those come from me, and that's something that I do monthly.
Yeah, those are great newsletters. I've subscribed to them and really enjoy reading them.
Yeah, that's actually how we got in touch, because you replied to the GF Ideas newsletter. So yeah, I appreciate having you in the community.
Yeah, it's a great way to stay up to date on all things alt protein related as well. I'll provide a link to the sign up for that in the show notes.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Why do you feel that corporate engagement is an important aspect towards ending factory farming?
As I mentioned before, kind of coming back to the theory of change, I believe that factory farming will end when we have scaled products that are tastier and cheaper than their conventional counterparts. So given this, engaging with the food industry is highly effective for getting this change to occur faster than it would on its own. So as I mentioned, we engage with startups who are innovating new technologies and pioneering new product categories, as well as very established meat and CPG, that's consumer packaged goods, food companies who already have the distribution and scale necessary to make these products widely available. And we also engage with other enablers in the supply chain and investors to increase funding in this space, as well as retailers and food service companies. And our work is sort of a positive feedback loop with other really important components of this path to ending factory farming. A real urgent need is public funding of alternative proteins. So alternative proteins are a key climate solution with the potential to mitigate up to 20% of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's 20% of greenhouse gas emissions come from the food and ag sector. That number comes from a study published in Nature, but there are a couple other studies with similar ranges, and governments need to be stepping up to fund it. And there's been some really exciting activity in that in recent months. Actually, China very recently included cultivated meat in their 5-year agricultural plan, which we were really excited to see. And there are also champions of alternative proteins in Congress as well. And so we're really hoping that the United States and other countries step up to increase public funding of research. So in this sense, corporate engagement and policy are really enablers of each other. So the corporate activity thus far has demonstrated the tractability of alternative proteins as a climate solution, which in turn hopefully demonstrates to governments that this is really potentially impactful climate solution that they should fund, which then in turn will support the industry. And then underpinning all of it is the technological innovation that makes alternative proteins possible. So I think they're all connected, but corporate engagement is certainly a very critical piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, definitely. And as you mentioned there, it's important that we make an effort on all fronts in order to achieve this transition.
Yes, exactly. It's an enormous task, so we need a lot of people working on it.
So what do you enjoy the most about your position at the Good Food Institute?
Beyond being able to make an impact, which I think is probably the thing that I value most highly in my career, just getting to work with the most compassionate, diligent, driven people I've ever met. I just love the culture and the people at GFI.
Yeah, that seems to be a common theme. A lot of guests on the show really enjoy the people in this space, and I myself feel the same way. It's really the people that make it so enjoyable and push you and motivate you to do more, and everyone is extremely passionate.
Definitely, I found the same thing, and not just at GFI, just meeting other people in the alternative protein space. a lot of people are really just driven and really excited and really kind. So yeah, it's definitely a big perk of working in this industry.
So what would you say is your least favorite part of your job?
I'm sure that a lot of people who do mission-driven work can probably relate to this, but there's always more to be done than we're able to do. And replacing conventional animal agriculture with alternative proteins is an enormous task. The scale of it is really mind-boggling, actually, and the amount of work that needs to be done can feel really endless. And I think GFI as an organization has done a really great job of laying a strategic foundation that helps us prioritize our work. But I think that at a certain level, that's always going to be a challenge, that there's just more work to be done than we're able to do in a given day or week.
Yeah, I can see that. I think it's around 1% of all meat sales are plant-based, which is fairly small when you think about it. We have a long way to go, but looking back at all the progress that's been made thus far, it's important to think that we're on the right path and things are growing pretty quickly. And I know in the Alt Protein Project Slack group, there's a channel called Small Wins. And every so often, someone will post a small achievement or accomplishment that they've made there. Things like that can really help motivate you. Like, hey, we feel like we're making progress.
Yeah, definitely. So as I mentioned, I put together our 2 newsletters, and one of them is a sort of large industry update where we try to cover activity across the commercial landscape and investments and new technological developments. And putting that together is a highlight of my month every month, because the amount of progress that we're making in just a month time frame is just so incredible. But it also is really important to put that into perspective, that as you said, plant-based meat is around 1%, but it is important to just remember the scale of the task ahead. And one example is in a white paper that GFI released in January, they did this production volume modeling. So modeled a scenario in which plant-based meat was 6% of the meat market. And in that scenario, we would need 810 facilities running 2,000 extrusion lines, which sounds like a lot, but then you consider that there are 7,500 slaughterhouses in the United States alone. So when you put that into perspective, it's just a lot of work to be done. But I do have faith that we'll get closer to 100% alternative protein market share in my lifetime.
Yeah, I hope to see that day as well. I know you've been involved with the hiring process at the Good Food Institute, and I was wondering if you'd be able to share any advice or tips that you may have for getting a job either at the Good Food Institute or just for the alternative protein space in general.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with the cover letter. This is your persuasive essay to the hiring manager on why they should consider your application. I know a lot of people find cover letters pretty tedious, and I know they can be really time consuming to write, but when they're well written, it's a huge opportunity, especially if you're earlier in your career and maybe don't have as much experience, to really lay out why you'd be a great fit for that organization and position. And this should go without saying, but you'd also be surprised that your cover letter must be tailored to the organization. You should write a new cover letter for every job that you applied to, in my opinion, and really show that you did your homework. Another thing is attention to detail in your application materials. So I'd recommend reading your cover letter and any short answers out loud to check for errors, installing Grammarly or similar software on your computer. I'm not going to say that a simple grammatical error is going to totally destroy your application, but it's definitely not going to count in your favor. And that kind of thing is totally controllable on the applicant's end. So just make sure that you're giving your application that attention to detail. And now thinking a little bit more broadly, I definitely recommend that people get involved in the alternative protein ecosystem. There are so many ways to get involved just at GFI. For example, we now have networking after all of our events, which is a great way to meet people. You can also leverage all of the free information that we share online with employers and demonstrate that you've built that sector specific knowledge. I think if you were to go through a lot of the material on our website, you can build up quite a bit of knowledge on the alternative protein system, which is something that then you can take to employers and use to demonstrate your interest. I'd also love to cover just the topic of informational interviews. a lot of this advice is not necessarily for GFI specifically. I mean, it can definitely apply to GFI, but I think can also be used more broadly. I think it can be incredibly helpful to talk to people who are in roles or organizations that you might want to go into, and people can also be more accessible than you think. So my biggest tip for informational interviews, similar with the hiring process in general, is to do your homework, research the person you want to reach out to, send them a well-written and personalized pitch that explains why you're interested in talking to them, demonstrates that you've done your homework and aren't going to waste their time. And most people are really happy to pay it forward and take these types of requests for a really well-written pitch. So I definitely recommend taking advantage of that. And then a final piece here is using digital content and building your personal brand online. So get on LinkedIn. When I was applying to GFI, if you had looked at my LinkedIn, you probably would have thought I already worked at GFI just based on everything that I was sharing and commenting on. And the hiring manager is very likely going to be looking at your LinkedIn at some point in the process. Many roles actually ask for it in the application. And this is just another opportunity to demonstrate your interest and fit for the role. And Twitter can also be really great for personal branding. I think I would prioritize LinkedIn, but there's a pretty strong alternative protein community on Twitter as well. And so these digital platforms can be really great, especially, again, if you're earlier in your career, don't have as much experience. You can use your online personal brand and use your cover letter to really build a narrative around why you'd be a great fit for something. Even if you maybe don't have as much experience as other candidates who are applying, you can really build a narrative to set yourself apart.
Yeah, fantastic advice. And LinkedIn is also a really great resource for connecting with people who you may want to have a more informational interview with.
Yeah, absolutely. I get informational interview pitches on LinkedIn, and often someone will request to connect with me on LinkedIn. And I'm definitely happy to accept that request, even if I don't know the person, if it's well written and personalized. Again, this comes back to the idea that people can sometimes be more accessible than you think.
So you talked a little bit about advice for cover letters. Is there any advice that you have for resumes?
A few things. So you want to make it really readable. Keep in mind that the person looking at it is probably not spending too much time scanning your resume, and thinking of the resume and the cover letter together as well, right? You don't want your cover letter to necessarily be just a narrative version of your resume, but you want to use it to highlight the most important parts or explain, for example, if there was a gap in your resume or if there was a particular experience that you think is really applicable to the role that you're applying for. You can expand upon that in your cover letter. But I think the main thing that I would say for the resume is keep it pretty simple, keep it readable. And it's always helpful to have someone else take a look at it for you, because sometimes it can be harder to take that step back and look at it if you've been working on it yourself for a while. So I think that having a trusted friend or a mentor take a look at it is always a good idea.
Yeah, because they may have a different perspective or may view something differently that you hadn't thought of or considered before. Yeah, definitely recommend having it proofread. Another thing I've read a lot in terms of writing resumes is you should really try to write it with the employer's perspective in mind. So for each bullet point that you have, try to structure it in a way of showing how what you did benefited the company that you worked for. Ideally, if you can have quantitative measurement, like reduced costs by 20% or something like that, that really stands out from a potential employer's point of view.
That's really good advice. I think having examples and stories both in your resume and cover letter are really important. And another thing I'll just say for the resume is don't think that you need to put all of your work experience on your resume. Just like your cover letter is tailored to the particular role, your resume can be too. And I know if you're earlier in your career, maybe you don't have as much on your resume, and this becomes even more of a consideration, I guess, if you're later in your career and your resume just gets longer and longer. You definitely want to be really tailoring it to the role. But even early in your career, you want to make sure that you're featuring the work experience on your resume that's going to be most interesting to employers, and don't feel like you need to add it all.
Yeah, and if you're struggling to tailor it to the job, an easy trick I like to use is looking at the job description, trying to pick out what the key words or things that they're looking for, and seeing what skills that you have that match that or are similar to that skill, and saying, okay, I have this skill, let me put that at the very top, or highlighting the experiences that you feel would be relevant or suitable for the position that you're applying for.
That's such a good point. And the job description should be open on your desktop as you're working on these items. I think it can really serve to your advantage if you incorporate a lot of items from the job posting into both your resume and cover letter. And employers are going to be looking for that to demonstrate in their language that you'll bring the skills to the role that they're looking for. So it's really helpful to keep the job description very much at the top of your mind as you're putting together your application.
So I've seen through GFI's newsletters that GFI is actively hiring for multiple roles. Are there any you want to highlight here?
Yes. So you can check out our open roles at gfi.org/careers. We have a variety of roles open in almost every department right now. And at any given time, we normally have at least a couple of roles open, and they range from early to mid-career to later career. So the more early to mid-careers we have open as of the time of this recording. And if you're listening to this in the future, go to gfi.org/careers to see what's open. But right now, as of April 2022, we're looking for an executive assistant for corporate engagement. So if you were intrigued by my first job at GFI, corporate engagement assistant, I can tell you that role is super fun, comes with great professional development opportunities. So definitely apply if you were really interested in the corporate engagement work I was describing. And then if any listeners are located in the Asia Pacific region, we also have a digital marketing associate position open. And we also have a general interest application on our website. So if you're very interested in working at GFI, but you don't see a role open that matches your background and interest right now, definitely fill out that general interest application. And that'll also allow you to keep in touch and be notified as new roles are posted. And then finally, we have a paid internship and fellowship program as well. So check back throughout the year because we do open those pretty frequently. And then for people who are looking for open roles with alternative protein companies, we also have a few resources to help you find those. So in gfi.org/vocation, that is a job board with open roles with alternative protein companies. And I've actually started to see a lot more entry-level positions open lately with those companies. I know that's a question we get a lot, and maybe some of your listeners are more in the STEM fields, and those have been the types of roles that have been historically open in most alternative protein companies. But now, as companies have started to raise their Series A and Series B, a lot more positions are opening up in the industry for the business background folks as well as entry-level positions. I know I saw a couple executive assistant positions open in a couple different companies last month. So definitely keep an eye out for those. And then we also feature some positions in the GF Ideas newsletter, gfi.org/community. You actually will get some open positions in your inbox every month. And then finally, if you're a student and you're interested in getting involved in the ecosystem, but not able to do it as a full-time job just yet, definitely check out the Alt Protein Project. That's our student group affiliation, and you can find more information about that on GFI's website.
Wow, that's quite the variety of resources, and I'll definitely provide links to all of them in the show notes. Are there any other resources that you recommend?
Yes. One resource I've really been enjoying lately is 80,000 Hours. So for people who aren't familiar with 80,000 Hours, it's an organization that provides a lot of content and resources around using your career to make a large impact. And 80,000 Hours is named for the average person spends 80,000 hours working in their career. And so what do you want those 80,000 hours to go to? And this resource is all about making sure that you're working towards a high impact cause area. And so I've been actually recently working through their long-term career planning course, and it's really great. They have a lot of content and articles you can read, and then questions that you answer that just help you do some more foundational thinking about your long-term career prospects and how you might want to think about building up career capital, especially if you're earlier in your career. So that's a resource I definitely recommend. I also love the work of Cal Newport. So he wrote the book Deep Work, Digital Minimalism. He has a couple other books, but he writes a lot about career satisfaction. And I just find his work really accessible and interesting. So would definitely recommend if you're interested in what makes a career satisfying and what kind of work do I really want to be doing.
I love 80,000 Hours. I think that they're such a fantastic resource, and I've gone through their career guide, and it's been very beneficial for myself and helping plan out my career path. And they have a lot of really great resources and articles just on general career advice, how to apply for a job or how to prepare for a job interview or how to write a resume. One other resource that I would add here is GFI has a quarterly careers call, which is a Q&A session where you can ask any questions that you have about getting a job in the alternative protein space. Are there any other things that you would like to add or talk about or mention?
I'll just add that if you're listening and you're working on something exciting in the alt protein space, or you want to be and you're looking for a role, or you're a student, I definitely love to chat with you. So everyone listening can please feel free to keep in touch with me on LinkedIn or Twitter. So it's Maille O'Donnell on both. That's MAILLEO''DONNELL. I would just love to hear from you. I think it's so exciting that you're doing this podcast, Jeffrey. I think this is filling a great need in the alt protein space and educating people who are earlier in their careers. So just really grateful to be part of it. And I would love to keep in touch.
Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate you willing to share your contact information. And it's been such a delight to have you on the show.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeffrey. Had a great time.
The Cultivating Careers in Alternative Proteins podcast is now on Instagram. Please follow to learn about job opportunities in this field, receive tips for job seeking, and find out about the latest episodes. A link will be provided in the show notes. Thank you for listening to this episode. Hopefully, Maille's advice will help those of you who are trying to find a job. Also, her experience in the area of corporate engagement shows that there are so many roles that are needed in this field, some of which you may not have even heard of or even thought about. This is why I am confident that there is a place for everyone, including you, to be a part of the alternative protein revolution.